Hi, I'm Ryan Davis.
And I'm Kiernan Schmidt.
And this is Out of Office, a travel podcast.
Just seat taken.
Hey, Kiernan.
Ryan, stop trying to distract. We don't have time for small talk. We've got a lengthy interview today. So
I thought he was really yelling at me,
No.
folks. I was like, what did I do?
No, I wasn't really yelling at you. I was joke yelling at you. But Ryan, we've got a whizbang interview today. It was so urgent that we bring it to the people, to the podcasting audience, which, by the way, I have to say, COVID's been bad for a lot of stuff. Really good for the download numbers.
People are, they want to travel. They want to take that, what do we call it? Aoral escape.
Oh, the aoral escape. Sure.
Aoral escape, yeah.
Nearly our tagline. Good. Aoral escape, Buster Brown. Well, Ryan, I've got an interview today with an author of a new book called Leave Only Footprints, and his name is Connor Knighton. And Connor Knighton took 1 year of his life on the centennial of the National Park Service, and he used the year, he traveled to all the national parks.
Does he know that this is your dream?
He knows it's my dream. He acknowledges in the book that many people set this as a life goal. And
Right.
And we talk about, life goal versus forcing it into 1 year and the positives and negatives about that in the very interview. And so he's got stories to tell. And, this guy, he's a polished speaker. He's actually a correspondent on CBS Sunday Morning. So
really?
So, I mean, he's a master who we are learning from.
So this wasn't his life goal.
It wasn't his life goal. He had a bit of
because he's a young man. It would be a shame.
That's right. He's a young man.
Yeah.
He had a personal setback in his life. An engagement broke up, and he needed to get out of his head. And friends were telling him, take a trip. And he said, I'm going to do you one better. I'm going to put everything I own in storage, and I won't see you for a year. And everyone said, whoa, you're kind of overreacting to what we were suggesting. We thought maybe a weekend in the Berkshires.
Right. But no, he went and he just traveled the country and went to all of these national parks.
He flew back and forth. I mean, this is truly...
He flew. I mean, his carbon footprint is going to be crazy.
He flew, he drove, he swam, he boated. I mean, he did everything you could possibly imagine. And he was taping some segments for CBS Sunday Morning in some of the parks, and then he was making up the difference on his own. And it's a thrilling tale. And so, Ryan, I got to tell you, I don't want to waste any more time because we're in a rush. We got to get to it. I say, let's take off and get to my interview with Connor Knighton, the author of Leave Only Footprints.
Hey, cabin crew.
That's not how it goes.
Okay, let's take off. Wait, what do I say? Oh, my God. All right, Kiernan, I think it's time to take off.
Tell the cabin crew.
Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff, please.
I'm joined today by Connor Knighton, a journalist, correspondent for CBS Sunday Morning, and the author of the new book, Leave Only Footprints, My Acadia to Zion Journey Through Every National Park. And Connor, I had to, when I read that title, I thought you must have been very glad when you realized that there's park names that start with A and Z, because it really wouldn't have worked well without that.
Right? Thank goodness. Yeah. My Acadia to Yellowstone journey would have been
so close. So close. And I think Zion's the only Z, if I recall correctly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so basically, you've written a book about your odyssey, exploring every national park. And one thing that doesn't make it into the title is you did it all within the bounds of a year. Yeah. So let's kick off by saying, what prompted you to take this journey across all the parks?
So I did it during the centennial of the Park Service. So in 2016, it was the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service. I'd seen that article sometime at the end of 2015. And at that point, I was in sort of a self-imposed kind of self-quarantine. I'd recently had an engagement dissolve. My plan for 2016 was going to be very different. That was the year I was supposed to get married. And then all of a sudden, I found out that would not be happening. And so I was sitting around the house, moping, as you might be in a situation like that. And so my friends had suggested that I needed a change of scenery. I'm sure see every national park in the country was not what they had in mind for that. So I far overcorrected. But I had pitched my bosses at CBS Sunday Morning, where at the time I was just a sort of occasional freelance correspondent, that we do a piece on the Centennial. It's a show where a piece about the national parks would feel very at home, or a few pieces about the national parks. And so instead of just a one-off segment on that 100th anniversary, I suggested that maybe we do a year's worth of park segments. They must have enough stories, the food, family, art, architecture kind of pieces that we do on Sunday Morning. You can find those in the parks. And so I outlined this very ambitious pitch where we would do this year-long series. They said yes, not to every park, but to maybe a third that we do on the broadcast. And so then at that moment, I decided that I would go all in. I'd been living in LA for the past 10 years, but I decided to give up my place, put my stuff in storage, and live for that entire year on the road. So occasionally I would be doing pieces for the show where I would send back fully produced television segments, and then sometimes I'd just go take a fun hike in between, and use the money that I had been spending to live full time in LA to supplement that time when I was off the clock, to hit the extra parks in Alaska, to hit the extra ones in Utah, wherever I happened to be.
And at the time, during the Centennial, there were 59 parks, right?
Yeah, there are 62 now.
Right. And you've made up the difference in the years hence. Yeah. And so was your original pitch to do a segment on each of the 59?
I thought about that. And then very quickly, my boss was like, listen, like there's more of those than there are weeks in the year. Right. And like, we didn't want fatigue to set in with our viewers. Yeah. It's nice to have something that became a regular series that people looked forward to, and I think now look back on fondly, but there may have just been another park kind of piece. Certainly from his perspective, that was the concern. At one point, he sent me an email saying like, I'm afraid it just might be a whole lot of trees. And so I had that note in the back of my head all year long to just not have it be that. I mean, Sunday Morning at the end of the show always has a moment of nature. That's what people, it's a tradition that we've done for the 40 years that the show's been on air. And that is trees or sunsets or a bald eagle flying across the screen or whatever. But these were stories. And so, they may be set among the trees, but it could be a story about citizenship in American Samoa, or a story about the history of the Kentucky Cave Wars. And so any piece that I looked to pitch for the broadcast, I always had him in my head saying, don't make it a lot of trees. And so they were the kind of stories that could have aired in any year, that could have aired in or outside of a park. And then in between those, I made up the difference on my own, partially just because it seemed like a cleaner premise. I was so sold on the idea of that every park in a year concept that even when they said no to it, I thought, well, gosh, that's what I want to do. And when else? It was an easier headspace to be in. I think had I continued to fly back to LA while occasionally doing these stories, it's just weird to be eating a soft pretzel at the Grand Canyon and then flying back to LA for a sushi dinner or something. It was just better to sort of stay in camp mode. Packing wise, it was easier, and to live out on that road. Also, when else will I ever have the chance to do something like that again? So it was taking advantage of that opportunity, and also just happening to be in my personal life exactly what I needed at that point.
And by the way, I do want listeners to know, it's not like I'm prying about the engagement. That is the framing device for the book. Yeah, it's page one, and we get to experience some of your adventures in dating on the road and flirtations on the trail. So it's a nice theme that runs through the book.
Yeah. And I debated whether to include that in the book.
Sure.
Certainly it never made its way onto the broadcast. But
no, that's not exactly CBS Sunday Morning material.
I do occasionally get like grandmas trying to set me up with their granddaughters. But it felt dishonest to not. So it's it's what set that in motion, or that journey in motion. And then I'm off to the races sort of after that. But to not mention that is sort of why I happen to have this time in my life to do something like this would have felt dishonest to not include. So.
And once you were committed that CBS was going to sponsor some of it and produce content out of some of it, did you know right away that you were approaching the year with the idea of writing a book at the end?
All I knew was that guy who goes to half the parks doesn't get a book. So my Acadia to Shenandoah journey is less exciting. So, but I never written a book before. It would have just been too presumptuous and overconfident to think that I might have that in me. I considered it. I thought, well, gosh, maybe at the end of this there's something. But no, it was not. It wasn't a pitch where, I didn't have a literary agent. I didn't have a publishing contract. I thought maybe once this is all done, and who knows, maybe it wouldn't have been interesting enough. I kind of was going to wait until 2017, no matter what, with all of this in the rearview mirror to look back. And ultimately, what I realized looking back was that the advantage of going to all of them and not just some of them is that you start to see these threads that tie them together. And so that's ultimately how I structured the book, was thematically. So it is not a chronological journey. It is not a geographic journey. It is looking at the parks in total and then picking out that, hey, dry tortugas in off the coast of Florida and petrified forest in Arizona both taught me lessons about forgiveness. Katmai in Alaska and great sand dunes in Colorado both had something to say about sound and the importance of quiet. And so that's ultimately how I approached the book when it came time to write.
Yeah, I could see where the biggest challenge, I would think, to structuring the book is you don't want it to become that list. It's right. Like what you were describing with CBS Sunday Morning. You don't want it to be, and here's the national park segment yet again. Mm-hmm. And you're not the only sort of journalist or influencer out there who's approached this goal of visiting all the parks. And especially on Instagram, you get a lot of Instagram influencers, I say with quotations, who are doing this. And it does become monotonous to a certain point. And what appealed to me about the book was this grouping of parks by theme, because you are showing connections among parks that don't naturally connect in my mind. So listeners know I'm a big national parks nut. I'm more on the type of person. I've never had the time to take on what you've had, but you mentioned in the book, a lot of people have this as kind of a life goal. That's where I put it.
And a far saner way to do it, by the way. Like it's absurd to tackle them all in a year. I think you really get to treasure if you're taking 1 or 2 or even 5 trips a year. Like then you really appreciate those parks as standalone experiences. So. Yeah, I think you're probably doing it the right way.
But as you say, the book deal doesn't come. So, it's a give and a take.
Or it does. You just have to be 80 when you sign that contract.
So I want to talk about the grouping into themes. So why don't you talk through what was the process, since you didn't know there was necessarily a book at the end, what was the researching, note-taking, and grouping process as you approached the writing of a book?
Well, so the flip side of that premise is that you do have to include all of them, with most,
right.
Like there's an obligation that you set this up from the beginning. So, and they're not equally interesting.
No, they're not all created equal. Yeah.
No. Although actually, they're probably more equal in terms of stories than they are in terms of scenery. So there are some like the hot springs in Arkansas that is not a big naturey kind of hiker type park, but a fascinating story about the golden age of bathing and the history of the American bathhouse.
Right.
And people would flock from all around the country to treat everything from syphilis to polio by taking these waters. And so there was plenty to write about with each park, but you did have to include them all. So I sort of felt like I was solving some sprawling murder case where I had like cards up on the wall, and I'm like, okay, like I've got this one linked with this. How do I?
Did you actually do an up on the wall?
Yeah. Well, sort of a digital version of that.
Sure. Okay.
And then like a lot of like written on, notebook paper kind of scraps and stuff. And then sometimes blowing that up and changing it. There were some that were very obvious, and then there were some that only when I got down to like this sort of like leftovers pile of 10 was I like, okay, how does this one fit with that? But none of that was top of mind while I was undertaking the journey. That was really just about finding stories for the broadcast, and that became a challenge. So I think the people who you referenced on Instagram who are tackling this mostly as a lifetime journey, although there are a few people who have gone in a year. Even those people, they're just going to see the parks at their peak. They and that is not at all how I did it. So they're either going in a way that makes the most geographic sense, where it's the least amount of miles driven, or they're trying to hit peak experiences. I'm sometimes having to go to Mount Rainier in Washington because that was the one day that the Secretary of Interior was available to chat with me. And then a week later, scoot back to Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee because there was a story that I really wanted to do there on these abandoned cemeteries up in the hills of that park. And the one day a year that people are able to visit those cemeteries happened to be a week after that interview. So I occasionally will get requests to like share the map of what I did. And first of all, I'd have to reconstruct it. I don't even really remember. And it would be extremely frustrating for anyone to look at because it makes zero sense. You would just wonder why on earth. Yeah. Why would you pass by, Congaree to only come back to it 6 months later? There's a lot of backtracking. And so that was dictated by my day job of trying to find these stories for the broadcast and get those on in time. And then in between picking up the ones for me that I wanted to do on my own.
And so how far ahead were you able to plan, and how often were you planning around, that once a year event? Or was there happenstance where you got to a park and you said, oh, I'm so lucky I got here, right in time for X attraction?
Yeah, it was a mix. So take the sled dog puppies of Denali National Park in Alaska. I knew, and I forget at what point I read about those, but I was like, oh, that's just the TV producer in me realized like that's gold. Who doesn't want to put cute sled dogs on there? This is great.
And you needed the picture for your Tinder profile.
Yeah, exactly. I wish I had that foresight, but oh boy, has it proved successful. Although actually weirdly, I overdid it. I've since realized that like there's a picture where I have like 3 of them on my lap. And so 3 puppies in aggregate looks like a weird goat. Like there's not enough separation in the fur. So what I thought was adorable ends up leading to a lot of weird questions of like, what creature have I kidnapped? But at least it's a conversation starter. But I'm this weirdo who's calling that park from Great Basin National Park in Nevada, calling Denali and trying to find out when their dogs have made it because I need to extrapolate from that when we can get there. So that's something where like I'm planning months ahead of time to be there 2 weeks post-birth, which is when the puppies are at their cutest, and then really building the rest of my Alaska itinerary around that date, because basically everything else I did there was flexible. And then some of it's on the fly. I met someone in Arizona who just in passing referenced the Devil's Hole pupfish, this extremely rare fish that lives in a pond in Death Valley. I'd never heard of it before. And then that became a story that we aired like on national television, thanks to a passing reference. That was actually someone I'd gone on a date with who just mentioned that like at dinner. And I was like, wow, like that actually is a really, really cool story. And so when I set off to hit the parks, I assumed that we would do a piece on Yellowstone. We'd do one on Yosemite. We ended up not doing either of those for the broadcast. And it's because early on, I started finding that the parks I'd never heard of, the great sand dunes of the world, those proved more interesting to me. I think, if I can, from the first 5 seconds of a piece, tell you about a place that is a national park you've never heard of, already my work's partially done for me. You're interested. How have I never heard of Kobuk Valley? How have I never heard of Cuyahoga Valley National Park? And then I can start telling the story from there. But I had maybe 5 or 6 when I set off that I thought were possible, but most of it was planned on the fly. So it became a full-time job. I mean, it in my off time, I was often writing about a place I had been, planning a place that I would be 2 months from then, and then trying to experience the place where I was.
And how many ultimately became CBS Sunday Morning
like about
segments?
A third, I think. It was probably about 20 some. I mean, occasionally we'd double up where like we would do a piece on disappearing glaciers that might, primarily be set at Glacier National Park in Montana, but feature a bit of Kenai Fjords in Alaska since I was there. I mean, they got a ton of bang for their buck as far as that goes. Like we would never fly to Alaska to get 15 seconds of B-roll, but since I was there anyway, it was easy to pick up a lot of that stuff. So some of them felt a little bit bigger than they would have otherwise. But yeah, about a third for the broadcast. And then, but the book touches on them all equally. So I think when you're reading it, you don't necessarily know what was on air and what wasn't. And actually there were stories that we did for the show that aren't in the book at all. So at Mesa Verde in Colorado, the piece we did for Sunday Morning was on their artist in residence, who was a landscape quilter. And I don't know how familiar you or your audience is with Sunday Morning, but like it's the kind of show in which I had to search our archives because I was sure we must have done landscape quilting before. I was like, and weirdly, we had done like a rock and roll quilter, like a blind quilter. Like there were like 6 other quilting stories that came up, but we'd never done landscape quilting. So I felt like we could. It's this woman who, according to her, she paints with thread, and she was, replicating that landscape in cloth. In the book, the story of Mesa Verde is much more about the people who live there, the reason that it became a park, the ancestral Pueblo people who built those cliff dwellings. So there's not a ton of overlap in the writing, although a few of the stories that we did for the broadcast, I fleshed out a little bit more.
But you do a good job. Well, I mean, one of my favorite parts of the book, because I've been to many of these parks and I know the kind of broad history. I know why Mesa Verde is preserved, but you're always surfacing stories that go a level deeper or feature an oddity about the park that you really only learn about when you get there. And by the way, I in the show notes, we're going to include a lot of clips out to the CBS Sunday Morning segments that you did, which make great companion pieces to the book, because I recommend the book first and then going to watch them. But it really, having the video aspect brings to life a lot of these stories that you hone in on and find deeper meaning in. I'm struck particularly by the Death Valley pupfish that you had talked about. You gain greater access by the fact that you're a journalist who's actually, being featured on national television about these things. And so why don't you tell us a bit about the Death Valley pupfish and what it would look like to the average tourist who's approaching where they live?
And I would argue that a tourist should not go see that because it really is only if you have that access. And even then, more of an interesting tale than an interesting visual. So the Devil's Hole pupfish is in Death Valley. If you were to look at a map of Death Valley, it's 3 million acres or so. And then these 40 extra acres miles away from the rest of the park. And that is a late addition that was added, I believe, at some point in the 70s, just to protect this pond, essentially, is what it looks like from the surface. The Devil's Hole pupfish is one of, if not the rarest fish in the world. It lives in this maybe 10-foot long stretch of water in the middle of the desert. It is of an indeterminate depth, so it's more than just a pond. It's an aquifer, and so the water goes down into some cave system. No one's quite sure how deep it is. There are 2 dead bodies in there. There were a couple of guys locals who went basically hot tubbing, I guess, and then sort of sank or died.
Don't they know they can go to the hot springs?
Right? Yeah. Somehow they did not. So now there's a massive fence around it. I mean, it looks like a maximum security prison. Not so much to keep folks like that out. That was sort of an isolated occurrence. But the fish became very controversial with the local ranchers. So at some point, some alfalfa ranchers nearby realized that if there's water underground, if these fish, have access to this, then maybe there's water under their land. And sure enough, they were right. And so they drilled wells, and then the water table started to drop where the Devil's Hole pupfish lived, and the fish started to die off. And so it became this huge environmental controversy. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the court sided with the fish. And understandably, the farmers were upset, and I get it. Like it's their land. Why can't they have the water that's under it? But the pupfish were some of the very first listed endangered species. But because there's so few of them, it would just take a couple of drops of bleach to wipe out every Devil's Hole pupfish in the world. And so they've now built a backup population. So not too far from that pond, there's a facility where they have now bred them in captivity just in case something goes wrong. And it's more than just someone sabotaging them. There could be an earthquake in Taiwan that somehow, makes that water drop. And that's happened in the past where it's swished around because of something happening on the whole other side of the world. But they live for about a year. They're an inch long. And more charismatic than I would have guessed. But to see them, you have to really because it's so locked down. It was only when we went in, and we were there on fish counting day. So that's another event I had to plan around. As soon as I realized that was an interesting story. That's where I got extremely lucky, where it just so happened when I called them, they're like, well, you know what? We're going to count them in 2 weeks. And the way that you count them is with scuba equipment. So they dive into the pond and they are just sort of eyeballing it. They do multiple counts and then average those results. And I think it was something like 120 some pupfish left that day. And so, yeah, it was sort of a lesson in species protection. It's not always about the charismatic ones. It's not the bald eagle. It's not just the polar bear. Like, it's an all or nothing approach. You don't get to just save the cute ones. And so while it was and still is controversial that millions of dollars are being spent on preserving these little fish in the desert, for all we know, the cure for COVID lies in pupfish DNA. I mean, who knows? Right. So it's worth keeping around. So.
I mean, one thing that story captures, and that I think you surface throughout the book, are you really discover a lot about the national parks as an organization, and a lot of the unsung work that is done. I know the sort of scientific complexity of that facility that studies the pupfish really made an impression on you. And one thing that you mentioned that was a little nugget that I had never known about the National Park Service was this Natural Sounds and Night Skies division.
Yeah, so they're based, I believe, in Fort Collins, Colorado, and the night skies, I guess, makes a little bit more sense to me. And you think of stargazing when you think of going to national parks, although you don't really necessarily think of what the parks do to ensure that view. But at Great Basin in Nevada, one of the darkest places in the country, not that far from the brightest place in the world, Las Vegas. And so because of the remoteness of that park, because of the mountain range surrounding it, it can get very dark there. But in addition to that, there's some effort that the dark rangers, which is what the park rangers of that park. I mean,
is there a cooler title than that?
I mean, superhero
honestly,
team. Yeah,
it's straight out of Star Wars. It's great.
And so the dark rangers are partially education based, where they're doing presentations for how people can take this back to the communities where they live. But they use that park as a sort of testing ground for shielding lights, using red instead of white lights, just really using the minimum amount of human created lighting in that park. And it makes it a dramatic difference. I mean, it really opens up quite a bit of the sky that you wouldn't see otherwise. So even in larger cities like a Flagstaff, Arizona, they use a lot of that same light pollution reducing technique. And you can see it play out there. And then the other half of that division is the Natural Sounds division, where there's a catalog of sounds that they maintain, everything from, an elk bugling to a bird chirping, have some species that are now extinct they have sounds of, but they're really about measuring the noise level in a park. And so that is something you think about. You go to nature, you want a little bit of peace and quiet. And yet there is no park in the lower 48, at least, where you are outside of an airplane path. You will hear them pass over the sky at any point in the day. The roadways, obviously, not just impact a visitor experience, but they impact the way the wildlife migrate, and I met up with a scientist at Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado, measured to be one of, if not the quietest places in the country. There's a couple other that rival it depending on the time of year. But the sand there just really deadens the sound in the same way that like baffling would in a recording studio. And we should be recording this podcast there in the middle of the sand dune. Right. It would be much quieter. But it was more of a meditation on the importance of quiet and sound. And it really is, especially if you're coming from a noisy environment like a city, it becomes unsettling. It is so quiet there that you're hearing conversations from hundreds of feet away. You're hearing your own heartbeat. And you're really dialed into the environment that you might not be in a noisier town. And so that is a resource, and the night skies as well. Resources worth protecting that you don't think about as much. It's not so, there's the don't cut down tree, don't shoot the bison kind of park ethos, but also the audio environment, the skies, the level of darkness is all part of that mission. So
I mean, another thing you do in Great Sand Dunes National Park is go sandboarding, which did not make it into your book. Did you go sandboarding while you were there?
Overrated.
Did you do it?
Well, I attempted.
I attempted as well. Yeah, I agree. It's not as easy as sledding. As a born and bred New Englander, I know how to sled, but on sand, it's not as great.
No, yeah. I mean, I guess I have sandboarded in other dunes that I imagine that experience would be similar. Here, it was more of like a sledding thing, so I didn't actually get up on my feet. But I would see people do it. I mean, it's fine, I guess. But like snow is so much better. And actually,
Totally
White Sands National Park, our newest national park, so one I didn't go to during that year, but have since gone to. I gave myself permission to not do it there, because I was there by myself. I knew it would come up. Someone would be like, "Oh, hey, did you go sand sledding there?" And
Right.
I'm fine to say no. I've just gotten to the point in my life where it's like, no, I don't need to do that. I know that's a thing people do there, and it's not fun.
Right.
I mean, it's fun if you have kids or a group of people. It probably is fun to see your buddy trip and fall. But on my own, I didn't need to go get a red saucer and slowly scoot down a small hill. So I'm sure I'm.
Well, it's
irritating listeners who think it's the best thing that they've ever done.
Well, it's also to your point about searching out the lesser known stories, right? Because I like your kind of follow up in the book is that you are revisiting places over your life. It's not like you've done all the parks and you're saying I'm never going back, and that's because in some places you've done the kind of spectacular must dos, and now you're going to find the quiet corners, and others you really focused on the quiet corners, and you didn't want to put the spotlight on the one big feature everybody already knows about.
Yeah, well, and also because it's not a guidebook. So if you were advising someone what to just check off and do at Great Sand Dunes, talk to an audiologist who's come in from Fort Collins would not be high on the Lonely Planet list of things to do. It would be impossible. So the sledding or the sandboarding would be higher up on that list, but it's not meant to be particularly helpful in that way. So maybe you should do it. I don't know. For me, it was just the hiking and getting out there. I mean, it's a trailless park for the most part. There are a few trails up in the woods, but in the sand, it's just pick a direction and start going. And that's rare that you get to do that in a park. And so that's what I would advise is don't structure that experience too much, take plenty of water and then just walk out in whatever direction looks good to you.
Yeah, and I agree that it's not a guidebook, but I do think it's a book that if you are planning on going to the national parks, you're giving certain lenses to view parks through, and you do spotlight attractions that might not be in the top 10 list. And that was something that I'm perpetually frustrated by the park system website, because I think it can be hard to find the sort of hidden treasures, which is why, one tip that I always give is that you should engage the rangers and the volunteers who are sitting behind that desk, who know the park like the back of their hands, who many have spent decades in these parks or live in the local communities and can point you towards exactly what fits your interests or to get you away from the tourist crowds.
Yeah, I had that experience at Guadalupe Mountains National Park in Texas, where the one thing that comes up in a lot of guidebooks is that it's home to the highest peak in all of Texas, which I guess is impressive if you live in Texas.
Right.
It's not nearly as tall as like random mountains that are just outside of LA. And so, but the ranger there was like, yeah, I mean, you can do it. If you really want that bragging right, that peak bagging right. But otherwise, this hike, and I'm actually forgetting the name of it right now. I'm just this one gives you a better view. Do that one instead. You won't be able to say that you've been now to the 6th highest peak in Texas, but trust me, the 6th one is better than the one. And so many times I would ask those rangers. Although it's funny, sometimes I would ask for a restaurant recommendation. Weirdly, that is a thing a ranger cannot give you. Rely on the guidebook for that, because as a government employee, they're at least not supposed to endorse one restaurant over another. So I'd have some very cagey rangers. I think maybe that's because they knew I was with a news organization. They didn't want to get busted for recommending one chicken stand over another, because it gets touchy, especially in some of those smaller towns. If it was perceived that one pie shop in Springdale, Utah was the Zion National Park endorsed pie shop, then it would be a whole to do. So you won't get them to tell you what food.
I did like the anecdote about trying to climb the highest peak, though, because it did you do encounter rangers and volunteers who the park so well that there can be a certain eye-rolly, okay, tenderfoot. You think just going to that highest peak gets you what you want. But let me tell you, I recommend you got to leave your ego outside of the visitor center door. You got to just be open to the experience of ask dumb tourist questions. That's what you are. They are the experts. Do what they say. Sure.
With the caveat that like sometimes you run across folks who are like, oh yeah, you don't need to see Delicate Arch, which is the most famous arch in Arches National Park. Yeah, you probably should. Like there are 2,000 other arches and they are far less crowded and certainly worth a visit. But like, it is probably worth the hour of your time to walk out and see it. It's well known for a reason. So there are a few of those where it's like
they've seen it 500 times, and so they think you don't really. The picture really gets it. Just look online.
Yeah.
One thing that you surface there are still mysteries that are alive outside in the parks, and maybe more than what people would expect, because the parks have been around. Many of these parks have been around for a very long time. They have staff and full services devoted to them. One of the mysteries that you brought up, and I know this isn't one that you timed your visit around, but that captured my imagination, was in Congaree, the Synchronized Fireflies.
Yeah. So first of all, that park is a mystery to a lot of folks. I mean, that falls into the category of, even people from like Columbia, South Carolina do not know that Congaree is a national park or exists. For a park that is near as many metropolitan centers as Congaree is, very few people go. Plenty of mosquitoes go. So be careful for that. But the bug that you want to see would be the firefly. Sadly, I did not time my visit correctly to see that. But there are fireflies. And this also happens at Great Smoky Mountains National Park and one or two other spots in the South where for a set time every year, it's normally in June or late May, the fireflies all light up at the same time. And nobody really knows why. And so every once in a while, I would encounter a story like that in the parks where you just kind of assume that we live in an age where everything is so Googleable and we are able to explain every mystery in the natural world. And so when you do encounter something without a easily defined explanation, sometimes those stories stuck with me more. So I would find that at a few parks. And at Congaree, maybe, there's theories. Maybe it's a mating ritual gone wrong where like everyone wanted to flash first and then they all ended up just flashing at the same time. I don't know. Yeah, no one quite understands, but it's a spectacle. It's so much so at Great Smoky Mountains that it's a ticketed event. And as far as I know, this is the first year in many years where they actually haven't had it. The Fireflies had it, but people didn't go out and watch it because it gets real crowded because it's not even just throughout the park. It's in like one weird little campground in the park is where for some reason this all happens. And likewise for Congaree. At Congaree, it's the most popular event at an overall not so popular park. If you're going to go to Congaree, there's plenty to see beyond just the fireflies, but I'd say winter or late fall is probably a good time to see that park. It gets real muggy. It was actually originally called Congaree Swamp National Monument. And so later they renamed it.
The branding folks got to it.
Yeah. And arguably, as I've seen, especially recently, these three parks that have been added since the trip that I took, it is very much a branding thing. There's not a single grain of sand that changed at White Sands National Monument, which is now White Sands National Park. It is just the name. Right. And so, in Congaree's case, they may have added a few extra acres, but switching it from monument to park was partially a branding thing, but taking swamp out really was the most important branding thing. Right. We're like, no one's going to detour on their way to Myrtle Beach to go to a swamp. And a scientist would point out, it is not actually a swamp. It is a floodplain. And that's more of a technicality about how the water moves there. But, while you're out there, it feels like a swamp, certainly. But it is spooky. I mean, just walking around feels like there's all kinds of mysteries. There's like wild hogs that run around out there.
Well, this is why I wanted to plug Congaree. I feel like it gets a real short end of the stick in the parks, in the park among park enthusiasts. I think you've surfaced something really interesting there, and I love the swamp story. One of the I think greater both at marketing and mystery parks is Crater Lake. And partially because it is Crater Lake is a great descriptor, but they also have a long history of naming certain features, certain names that bring mythological and imaginary associations. And they have a very, as you would say, charismatic piece of wood that has a mystery that's called the Old Man. So I wonder if you could share that story with us.
Oh, that's one. When I called the park, because that's one that we did for the broadcast, the press person, the public information officer who I eventually connected with, could not believe that CBS News wanted to come and film a story about a stump, which is really what the old
it's
man
so
of the
much
lake
more
is.
than that.
I agree, and it is this piece of wood, probably a hemlock, that has been floating upright since before Crater Lake was designated as a national park. So for more than 100 years, it's been bobbing around the lake, sometimes traveling 5 miles in a single day against the current in a pattern that doesn't really make sense. You can find old issues of the Crater Lake Park magazine, Nature Notes, where they, from the 30s have maps of like it would go 5 miles this way and then 2 miles the other way. The boats that travel across Crater Lake in the summer, the tour boats and some research boats, are always keeping track of the old man's movements because they don't want to accidentally run him over or mess up the boat. Back in the 80s, there was a study of the depths of Crater Lake. It's the deepest lake in the country, and they were doing some research on what's all down there. And so they tied the old man up on Wizard Island, the island in the center of Crater Lake, one of those natural features with a mysterious name. And as soon as they did that, like the clouds rolled in, it started to snow in the middle of the summer. And so you have this situation where there's, scientists, PhDs in like aquatic ecology who are looking at each other being like, it can't be because we tied up the stump, right? But they went out and cut him free from his bondage and let him roam again. And as soon as that happened, skies clear up. And so I spoke with a scientist while I was there, thinking that he would give me the counterpoint to all of this, that people have, ascribed all of these mythical qualities to the old man, and he would ground me and be like, okay, this is why it's floating. This is why it's doing that. And he was all about the mystery. And it was really interesting to have that take from him where he's like, listen, I think there's some things that it's worth not knowing. He's like, we could take it out. We could carbon date it. We could do all kinds of stuff to it and figure out why it's doing this. And it's probably because it's waterlogged, where it like got dried out in one part and not dried out in the other part. But he's like, I'm also kind of fine not knowing. I like the mystery of it. And that interconnectedness of all things is something that is sort of key to us as humans when we look at the natural world. So as far as I know, he's still out there.
the reverence they show the old man is very charming.
I thought so too. Yeah. And I've actually emailed them. I haven't heard back, but I'm curious what the status is this summer, because they normally, Crater Lake's a park that's really only accessible during certain parts of the year, at least the lake itself. You can see it from the rim if you've got snowshoes in January, but to actually get down the trail to the lake is really only possible for a couple of months in the summer. And this summer, they're not running any boat tours because of COVID. And so I'm curious if they've had an old man sighting, because it's generally around this time every year where they see him for the first time. And one year he may not be out there anymore. Maybe he will have toppled over. But as far as I know, he is still the guardian of Crater Lake.
Yeah, I was there last June, and the snow was still piled high on half the drive around. You couldn't do the rim drive because the snow was still so prevalent. It's insane. Yeah. It's insane.
And so that's when, especially if you're trying to plan all these in a year, there's certain things like that where it's just like the Going to the Sun Road at Glacier National Park in Montana, one of the most scenic drives in the country, that doesn't open until late May most of the time. And so there's a good chunk of, Yellowstone shuts down for at least a couple of months spread out, at the end of each season as they prepare for winter and as they reopen for summer. And so there's this idea that, like the Joshua trees of the world are kind of always open, but there's a number of parks that you really have to be more strategic about with weather and access.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's where, if you're planning a trip to a park, you have to be open to the fact that you might not be able to do everything you want to do. And also you have to spring when you can. When I was in Rocky Mountain National Park, it was the first day that they were able to open Trail Ridge Road. And in my little putt car, I said to my wife, we've got to hit it right now while it's open for the first time. And we got to the top and it was like a raging blizzard still. I thought, oh, maybe this was a mistake and we might get trapped on the other side, by the way. But you have to be opportunistic, and you also have to accept, you may have a reason to go back because you didn't get to accomplish exactly what you did. A good example is in Denali. I think they call it the 30% club because only 30% of the time is the mountain actually viewable.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mount Rainier is probably even less than that. But in both cases, there's plenty to do where it's not a one and done type thing. So those are both parks that are named for mountain peaks where really the experience is below the peak on the trails and being out there.
So I feel like I could ask you, park by park for your stories, but the one I'd like to end with, and then I'll ask you a bit about practical tips for folks who are inspired, is the Biscayne Underwater Trail. Which, this is one of the hardest, this is one of the least accessible features, I would say, of a national park. And that's because Biscayne is largely below the ocean.
Yeah, 95% water. And so near a major metropolitan area, I mean, you can see the Miami skyline from the shores of Biscayne by the visitor center. And there's some picnic tables there and they're lovely, but not that much different than what you'd find at, in a lot of South Florida shoreline. And so Biscayne is really about protecting the water and what is under the surface. And so the rangers there like to point out that they have the same topography that a place like Rocky Mountain might have. It's just all on the bottom of the ocean. And so that's the coral reef, that's the aquatic life that's down there, and a number of shipwrecks. So that was was and still is a popular shipping corridor. And so you have all these like steamships or sometimes like a pleasure yacht on a New Year's Eve cruise from the 60s that have wrecked out on the reef out in the water. And so they have set up an underwater trail that goes through, it's 5 or 6 of those wrecks. And it's a trail in the loosest sense of the word. I mean, you have to boat from site to site. And that is something. The park has been working on this, and it's partially an issue of funding. They would love to take folks out on trips to do that. As it currently stands, you need access to a boat and scuba equipment. I mean, there's a couple you can snorkel to, but some of the better ones require being able to dive. So that's having certification, that's having equipment, it's having a buddy with you. And so for that reason, it's not an experience a lot of people get to have, but boy, am I glad that I got to do it. I mean, it's fascinating. And you, especially when you visit a few parks, it's weird to see how the type of sign that you would see by a roadside pull-off at Rocky Mountain, like that park sign with the logo and the description of what you're seeing, that's on the floor of the friggin' ocean. Like it's beside of this wreck. And it's like, this is the Lugano. It sank in 1903 and blah, blah, blah. And then you're diving along that shipwreck. And the aquatic archaeologist who I went out with that day, who showed me around, which is like what a cool business card to have. He is paid to interpret the human story of the park. And he was mentioning that shipwrecks are really special in that way, a lot of times more so than like a dig site that you might find even at a place like Mesa Verde, where there could be many years of human history all kind of in one garbage pile. And you're sorting through trying to figure out, okay, did this shard of pottery go with this era or was it left by this culture? A shipwreck is like one moment of time where a group of people who had everything they thought they needed to survive this journey or this day, all of that was deposited on the ocean floor in this one place. And so it really gives you a peek into what was happening, on that steamship bound for Havana or whatever it might be. And then just the bones of the ships are cool. It's an interesting thing to dive through. Now it's been colonized by fish. So, it's a home to several creatures and a watery grave for an old boat.
So it's worth the scuba certification.
I think so. I mean, in general, like, boy, I did not like the training of it. I did not. Our bodies aren't built for that, and nor are they supposed to be flying 30,000 feet above the ground either. But somehow on a plane,
Right.
It's easier to distract yourself from the very unnatural act of flying. But when you're underwater, even just 60 feet underwater, like, you are hyper aware that this is a place that you are not meant for. And there's just a lot that can go wrong. And when you're new to it, as I was then, I got my scuba certification just for that. All you're thinking about is what could go wrong. And so finally at that park, I was able to relax into it and appreciate being underwater for what it was. And more than just the ships. It's the sounds. You're hearing the gnawing on coral from some of the fish. You're seeing creatures that you would never see on the surface. And so once you're able to lock in and not think about getting the bends or your mask flying off or all the like horrible worst case scenarios that I'd imagine for myself on the floor of the ocean, I did come to like it. But that's also not a thing. There's things that I would not blanket recommend for everyone. Like, there's something wrong with you if you don't appreciate the majesty of Crater Lake from the shoreline. Like, that is a visual that is just stunning. It is so unlike anything else and so easy to see. Like, is everyone going to love diving to the floor of Biscayne? Maybe not. That is a qualified recommendation.
Well, and you also make the good point at Angel's Landing in Zion. I'm always amazed by how many people actually get up there, given how precarious it gets right at the end. Sometimes it is right to just say, all right, I've gone as far as can be safely done, and it looks good from here.
No, and that's one where that qualification is because of all the people who were doing it. So it's a well-known hike for a reason. It is stunning and challenging and an excellent view, but that's one I don't think I'll ever do again given the number of people who do it. The park is now struggling with that too, where they're considering regulating it, just permitting entry in general into Zion. But I trust myself. I don't trust everyone else to not fall or take a selfie or whatever.
No, I had an iron grip on that chain, that chain fence that gets you all the way. And I saw, other people are like popping bubble gum.
Yeah, wearing flip flops and there's
exactly.
no right or who am I to judge that they shouldn't be allowed there? That's a slippery slope, but it is literally a slippery slope.
But it's literally a slippery slope. Exactly.
So that's where I'm not comfortable with how crowded that one is right now. And also you get 95% of the view from the area right before where those change starts. So that's where I will stop.
That last 5%, I don't know. So to end, for those who are inspired by the book, by this interview, what practical tips do you have to share? Logistically, lots of these places are hard to get to, or a certain time of year is advantageous. So are there any website recommendations or guidebook series or organizational tools that you used that you think maybe aren't on everybody's radar?
I would say not being too concerned with peak season. So it's more about when you have the time for it. A park like Acadia, which is extremely popular in the summer, deservedly so. Maine is beautiful in the summer, but I went once in October. That's a park I've revisited. I first went in January for the book, and then went again in October. And I would now think that maybe October is the best time to do it. Fewer people, and the leaves are changing. So don't obsess too much about peak season. The park website, to your point, I agree, could be better. But there is it's poorly designed, but there is good information on the park.
If you put some time in. Yes.
So there's a lot of good stuff on there. And what I found myself, this isn't advice I always follow, but the more you understand the geology or the botany of a place, you're going to get more out of it. The Grand Canyon is a cool thing to see no matter what, but understanding the age of the rock, how it was formed. And it's tough to force yourself to spend time in the visitor center when you're in a beautiful natural place. So kind of reading up on it beforehand, I think, is a good way to arm yourself with that knowledge and not feel like you're wasting your time while you're there looking at exhibits instead of being out on the trail. And then, there's not, I had a couple of different books. National Geographic has one that's a guide to all the parks. But since that's not how many people are experiencing it, I think it's probably better to pick off, the so-and-so's book of the American Southwest or whatever, like much more regional specific ones than some sort of massive overview. I relied a little bit more on the massive overview ones, but I don't know if that's what I'd recommend. And then just wake up early. And that is certainly advice I do not always follow, but like it completely changes your experience. Like for the popular parks, of which Zion would be one. I mean, certainly Yosemite, Yellowstone, the ones you've heard of, like people sleep in, they want the hotel breakfast buffet. They've got kids who they're trying to get out of bed. And so if you can beat them in the door, and the difference between a 7 a.m. and a 10 a.m. is vast, and the wildlife are more active. You have the park to yourself. It's easier to find parking. So, and you're there. That's what you're there for. You're not there to like hit the town in Springdale, So if you're going to bed at 8:30, fine, like get out there early and see what you can. And then just, and I realize this isn't advice that everyone can follow, but if you are, athletic enough and you're okay with taking a hike, like the second you go more than a mile from the parking lot is when 80% of the crowd disappears. Many people are there to take that picture and move on to the next thing. So walk a little bit farther, wake up a little bit earlier, and you have a much better experience. And also don't worry too much about the food. I mean, that's another thing where like there's a pulled pork sandwich at Petrified Forest that is better than it has any right to be. It was one of my favorite national park meals, but it's still not why you'd go there, So like packing a lunch, like especially for the more popular parks, then you don't have to waste 2 hours of your precious time standing in line for a soft pretzel and a hot dog that are going to be exceedingly average. Take that time, have a picnic out on the trail. Don't worry about.
Food is not the attraction. And also to the point of getting up early, there's no nightlife to speak of unless you're stargazing. So go to bed early and get up early.
This is very basic advice, I realize. Sorry, that's...
No. Listen, this is advice that not enough people follow. Yeah. I think, if you go in with that mindset and you can put it on your itinerary, you can be ready to make the most of your visit. Well, Connor, thank you so much. The book, again, is Leave Only Footprints, My Acadia to Zion Journey Through Every National Park. We'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. And one sort of trademark that you did was you sang a piece of America the Beautiful at each park that you visited. It's compiled into a video, but I thought, what better way to leave the interview than to just play us out with a quick clip of our author.
It's not about it's the video that sells it. The audio is not much to speak of.
I'll link to the video, but you know what? It's an audio format.
Good luck.
Thank you so much, Connor, and we'll look for your future writings and your future segments on CBS Sunday Morning.
Perfect. Thank you.
Beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of rain, for purple mountain majesties above the fruited plain. America, America, God shed his grace on thee.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the last stop on this train. Everyone, please leave the train.
That was a fantastic interview. I'm incredibly jealous, but I'm also a little bit weirded out
by Connor.
Not by Connor. No, Connor seems like a lovely young man. No, by the these synchronized
the synchronized fireflies.
Synchronized fireflies.
Yeah, no, it's creepy. I know.
Well, and we don't know why that happens.
They don't know why it happened. This is part of the mystery that you find in the parks. I love it. Scientists, they're still trying to figure it out.
And it's so it happens yearly. So it is so regimented that they know when to sell tickets to it.
Right, that's right. Well, I don't know that they sell tickets. Do they sell tickets? No, you have to.
Well, they advertise it. They advertise it on. Right.
Yeah.
They advertise it on. So my can I transition into my last stop?
Well, I haven't explained what the last stop is. So let me for all the new listeners, many new listeners, I have to explain this is the last stop. It's my favorite segment. It's your favorite segment. It's popularly known as the People segment. It is the final segment of the show, and it's where we take a moment to each share one thing from our life. It might be something that we've done or something that we've got coming up. It might be something we've read, something we've cooked, something we've watched, anything that feeds the spirit of wanderlust, robust within us, even during the workaday, now quarantined week. Now, Ryan, I have to ask you, and I already know the answer because you sort of preempted it, but do you have a last stop this week?
I do have a last stop, Kiernan.
And it relates to Fireflies somehow?
Well, I'm still reading about this, so no one knows why the Fireflies flash at the same time, but one of the theories is a competition between males.
Yeah, mating ritual gone wrong.
Yeah,
Yes, I know.
They all want to be the first to flash, and let me tell you, males, you don't want to be the first to flash.
I mean,
you want to be one of the later flashers, okay?
Yeah, I mean, it's Connor describes it as potentially a mating ritual gone wrong, and trust me, I'm very familiar with mating rituals gone wrong.
Yeah, that was the other name that we almost did that podcast.
This guy's a good idea for a spin-off, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I am headed to the Smoky Mountains for the month of August. I will be recording this podcast in the Smoky Mountains, which is one of the other national parks these Fireflies do this weird thing in, although I'm not going to get to see it. But we will do an episode from me hiking the trail. I'll be up there.
Portable mic?
In little short shorts, like a 70s radio reporter.
We will not be recording that by video.
And so it's going to be really exciting. It's my first time really out of New York City in a really long time.
Besides these state park trips that you've been making.
Right, but those are all within a couple hours drive.
Now, Ryan, you got to watch yourself because Great Smoky Mountains, that is the most popular national park. It is the most visited national park.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of little parks around there. So, I think maybe we do an episode on the Smoky Mountain National Park, but then also all the little stuff around there. I'm looking at where my house is, and I'm near a couple reserves and things like that. So very exciting.
Well, that harkens back to the Peter Kujawinski state park interview that we had a while back. And one of the great tips was when you're heading to a national park, look at the lands, the protected lands that surround the park, because often you can hit the trail, fewer people, and just as beautiful scenery.
Oh, almost as beautiful.
Well, no, just as beautiful. It depends on where you're going. But I think around Great Smoky Mountains, you're going to get great scenery either way.
It's going to be beautiful. I'm very excited. So something to look forward to in August. Some hot Smoky Mountains content.
So and you're like just about to embark on this trip, right?
I'm leaving in a couple days.
Oh my goodness! And end of August, I'm heading up to Maine. So we're gonna have a great Smoky Mountains immediately followed by an Acadia. Fantastic.
Well, folks, get your national parks are being discovered. People are like, wow, there's an outdoors.
Overcrowding, definitely a problem.
Yeah, we're back to over tourism again. Just for a while there. It always
comes back to over tourism.
Yeah, it does. So, Kiernan, do you have a last stop this week?
I do have a last stop this week, Ryan. It's a depressing one. I'm sorry. Well, so yours was very upbeat. We have to bring balance to the force, as they say in Star Wars. And so you've gone to the light, and I'm going to bring in the dark, which is this new survey that came out from the American Alliance of Museums. Did you happen to see the headlines of what this survey showed? Very depressing.
Yeah, it was. It seems like a lot of museums are struggling right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a huge surprise, of course. Visitation is down because many of them have to be closed, and obviously people think that it might be more difficult to raise funds through donations at this time because people are stretched from COVID. Many have lost jobs, or people are saving out of fear of losing jobs. And so the American Alliance of Museums published a survey, and it showed that 16% of American museum directors said that there is a high risk that their museums are going to close over the next year and couple months unless they get some additional funding that they don't know where it's going to come from. That could come from government support, unexpected donations, or benefactors coming forth. But this just breaks my heart, especially because, I love the big museums, the landmark museums, but those museums are going to be fine, right? Like, I'm not worried about the Met and MoMA and Louvre, and I mean these things are going to be fine.
In a world where the Met and the Louvre are shutting down, like there are bigger problems than the Met and Louvre shutting down. But
on many podcasts past, I've talked about the small, quirky museums that I love. We've got great episodes, the obscure museums of London. And
1, 2, and 3.
Absolutely. And I think that these museums really make a place special. They give you reasons to go back. And these are the ones that are going to be most in danger of not being able to make it through this crisis.
Yes. So how should people reach out and support their local small museums?
I mean, if so
they can.
It's so hard right now because everybody needs support right now. Plus, we've got an election. I mean, you got to put money into like the Democratic candidates. Am I allowed to say that? We're not a political podcast, but people know where we stand.
Well, we have passports, so we probably voted for Clinton. I'm sorry.
Jeez.
It's true.
It is. Yeah, I'm sure statistically that's probably true. But yes, there's lots of different causes that they're asking for our dollars now. And I do think that if you are a person who loves this podcast, who loves to travel and who loves museums, put them on your donation list now, and don't wait for the end of the year when everyone remembers to give. Ryan and I used to work at Blue State Digital. We know donations just skyrocket at the end of the year. These museums, just like all your small businesses, need your dollars now to keep their doors open. And I think we got to follow our own advice, Ryan. Maybe we could even make an out of office donation out of our ad supported funds.
I think listeners should make a donation and they should say, hey, Kiernan and Ryan persuaded me to make this donation. So give them a shout. Get us a listener,
Sure. Okay.
Say this came from Out of Office.
I like that. I like that idea better than Out of Office, which has no money, giving money. So you and I will each take it upon ourselves. Why don't we, how about this? How about for our next last stops, we talk about what museums we chose to give a donation to.
Okay, yeah, we'll each make a donation, and then we'll circle back on that. We'll speak about it on the next stop.
And we would love to hear from our listeners, what museums are you going to support? Shoot us an email at outofofficepod@gmail.com. That's outofofficepod@gmail.com. A little different than our Instagram, OOO podcast. That's just good branding. You want to have two different names to remember. But outofofficepod@gmail.com is send us your museum donation story, and maybe we'll give you a shout out here on the pod. Maybe. We'll see what interesting museums you give to. Now, Ryan, what are we talking about next week?
Oh, are we doing this thing next week?
Yeah, we're doing this thing next week. So, we were very bad. Loyal listeners who remember, we're sorry.
I'm so excited.
Two times we have bumped a very important topic, which is the move to virtual experiences online. You've got Airbnb experiences. You've got Rick Steves' guide offering virtual tours and cooking classes.
Do you remember like MS Encarta?
I do, absolutely.
So to me, this is all like just going on MS Encarta, typing in Italy, and then watching like little thumbnail videos of like, please. So I don't buy it. I mean, no, I'm going to do one. You're making me do them, folks. I'm doing this under duress.
Yes. So we promise we are not going to bump this again. We're each going to do a virtual experience, and we're going to talk broadly about the tourism move into this during the pandemic, and then we're going to tell you how it was. So that'll be next time. And Ryan, by the way, I'm going to have to include in the show notes what Encarta is, because that really marks us as a certain time.
Well, there was MS Encarta, which was like the brand name one, and then the one that my family had, which was like the Funkin' Wagnall of whatever the discount online CD-ROM encyclopedia was.
All right, Ryan.
What? It's true. Well, until then, I'm Ryan Davis.
And I'm Kiernan Schmidt.
And this is Out of Office, a travel adjacent podcast.
The seat disinfected.
I hope that the virtual experience is better than when I just put the Paris Cafe YouTube video up for 8 hours and just pretend I'm working in a cafe.
Well, did you have to pay for that?
No, that was free.
All right, well, this one you got to pay for.
Yeah, I'm expensing this.